What's going on, everyone? You guys know I love my iPods. I've done so many videos on them. Actually, only like 2 videos on them, and I haven't even owned an iPod in so long. Like, last time I messed with one was, I think, my iPod 3rd generation, a video I made like months and months ago. But I recently got my hands on a cracked iPod Touch 6th generation. I know you guys are gonna hate me because the screen is cracked, but I promise you I'm gonna make it up in love, and I'm dropping a mixtape in a couple weeks. It's gonna change your life, so it's gonna make up for it, I promise. But what's interesting is that this iPod came out in actually 2015 in July, so it's a little bit over 3 years old at this point. It's more like 3.5. And this was the last iPod Touch they ever made. They never made another iPod Touch after this. I don't even know if they made another iPod after this, to be honest. Now, that's a bold statement. I don't know about it, but it's a possibility, and that's pretty insane. And what's interesting is that looking around, it looks almost like an iPhone 5, like we're pretty familiar with the design. But the interesting part is that the specs within it are actually more suited for an iPhone 6. Even though it came out in 2015 and the iPhone 6 came out in 2014, I feel like they could have made the screen bigger and the size bigger, but that's kind of a little petty thing I have to throw out there. The screen on it is actually 4 inches, and it's a 640 by 1136 panel. It's pretty much the same thing as like an iPhone 5 panel or an iPhone SE panel, and it feels almost like those phones as well. But keep in mind that this phone is actually a little bit thinner, and it just overall feels a lot smaller, in my opinion, than the iPhone SE, even though it's the same size. And I think that has a lot to do with how heavy the phone is, because this phone doesn't have like a cellular modem and it doesn't have a SIM card tray and all that stuff. They really were able to make this thing feel smaller and thinner than it really was. Looking around, this thing has a front camera up top. It does have the home button, no fingerprint sensor. I'm sure you guys have seen one by now, but it also has a lightning port on the bottom, a speaker grill, and actually the headphone jack, and we haven't really seen one of those in a while. We also have a camera on the back, and it's an 8 megapixel sensor. I'll talk more about that in a second, but ultimately the camera really surprised me. Now, turning it on, this is the craziest part about it, okay? Right now it's running iOS 12. I have iOS 12.1 on it, and that is pretty crazy, okay? I was not expecting this phone. Honestly, because it came out in 2015, it should last a little bit longer than the iPhone 6, but because it has the same specs as the iPhone 6, I think it's going to stop at iOS 12. I don't think it's going to go further, but that's pretty crazy. I was not expecting this phone to have iOS 12 on it, and it's crazy because I knew this phone had iOS 12 on it, but I was not expecting it to be as fluid as it is, and that kind of leads me into the performance factor of it. This iPod is actually pretty decently fast, and I've noticed that with a lot of iPods. The iPod 3rd generation seemed pretty decent. The iPod 4th I just bought, the 5th, I bought all those iPods actually recently, and they're all pretty decently fast for their operating systems. And the same thing with the iPod Touch 6th generation, and that might have something to do with the screen. I don't know, because the screen is so much smaller, but that's pretty insane. And actually the specs inside, I'll just have to tell you, it has the Apple A8 chip, which is the same chip as the iPhone 6, a dual core processor, kind of the same as the iPhone 6, and also has 1 gig of RAM. So all those specs are pretty much the same exact thing as an iPhone 6. And I'm not going to tell you the performance is amazing or anything like that. I don't think the iPhone 6 performance is amazing anymore, but what I'll tell you is that it's definitely surprising, okay? Because you think of an iPod Touch, you don't think it's capable of opening up like apps and playing heavier intensive games and things like that, but this iPod was able to do it, and I think iOS 12.1 really optimized this thing. I really wish I bought it earlier, even last year when iOS 11 came out, because I would have loved to do like some type of video on it, but I bought it too late, and I really wish I bought it sooner. But I think this thing is pretty capable in terms of the performance, okay? Even the first time I opened it, I was like, wow, that's a little bit faster than I thought. And I'm not saying, like I said, I'm not saying this thing is like as fast as an iPhone XS or anything like that, but what I'm saying is, for the time it was released and for how old it is and for how it looks like, it just doesn't look like it's capable of performing at a higher task than what it is. And so I was multitasking and things like that, and it was able to handle it. But then I went and played like Temple Run, and that ran perfectly fine as well. And I was like, okay, maybe this thing can handle something heavier. So then I played Fruit Ninja, that played perfectly fine as well. So all these little minor games, this thing will be able to handle perfectly just fine. But then I went and played Real Racing 3, and I was like, you know what, this thing's probably not going to be able to handle it. Like, it's probably going to have glitched frames all over the place. And I actually opened it, and it ran better than what I thought it was going to run. Okay, it didn't run perfectly fine, skip frames all over the place, but I would say it's about 80% of what the game should be. It was missing maybe 20% of the skip frames, which is pretty bad, but for a device of this caliber, I think that's pretty impressive. And I think I spent $60-70 on it, which actually is more than what I should have spent, even though it had a cracked screen. But I think for what it is, the performance aspect of it is much better than I thought. It's definitely not amazing. It's kind of in the good area. It's probably around the 60% area of performance compared to what it is now. But when you factor in the age, the price, the everything like that, it's probably around 70%, man, I'll be honest. So in terms of performance, it's not good. I could not use it every day, but it's much better than I thought. And now looking at the back, this thing does have an 8 megapixel camera. And again, this is another aspect of the phone that really surprised me. I was not expecting this thing to have this good of a camera as it did. So it has an 8 megapixel sensor. Okay, I'm not going to say it's the best camera, okay, anything like that. What I'm saying is that on an iPod, I mean, you have to remember the iPod before this actually didn't even have a back camera. They took it out, which was the dumbest thing they ever did. They added it on the 4th generation, but they took it out on the 5th, and it made no sense. But it was an 8 megapixel sensor. It was almost the same exact thing as the iPhone 6's camera. And on this iPod, you're actually able to shoot like slow-mo videos and things like that, and the photos aren't that bad. The camera sensor is pretty decent as well, and when you like move around and everything like that with the camera, like slow movements, it looks just like an iPhone 6 or 6S camera UI, so it's insane. And it should, because they're all running iOS 12. But for an iPod, you always thought like it was underpowered and this and that. And I'm sorry I sound like such a noob on this, but I never even owned an iPod Touch 6th generation. So it does kind of like surprise me in that sense. It is able to shoot 1080p videos. The front camera is actually 1.2 megapixels, so it's kind of up in the air. I mean, it's like it'll get the job done. It's not amazing, but in terms of the camera sensor, this is another one of those cases. Surprised with it. It's definitely not as good as I might think it is, but I'm just kind of fangirling about it. So I'm pretty happy with it. It's not really like amazing or anything like that, but it definitely surprised me for sure. And now leading on to something that doesn't surprise me, everything was kind of good up until this point. The battery life is kind of weird, okay? So it has a 1043 milliamp hour battery, and it doesn't have a lot going for you. It doesn't have like cellular connection. It's pretty much always on airplane mode except for Wi-Fi. That's pretty much how I would like summarize an iPod. And it's decent, it's decent, but I would have expected more from an iPod especially, This is a device that kids want to take with them everywhere, and people who don't want a phone or something like that, they plan on going hiking or I don't know, some case like that. I don't know, I'm not like an active person, but I would imagine cases like that, people would actually want to bring an iPod versus a phone back in the day. Now it doesn't make any sense because our phones are iPods. But even when this iPod was released, iPods were dying, obviously. But I think the battery life is one of those things where it's like not as good as you might think it is. It's like 1,000 milliamp hours, Even the iPhone 6 had like 1,800 or something like that. So I'll definitely tell you the battery life is probably one of the weirder aspects of it. It's not horribly horrible, but it's definitely not like amazing or good even. I'll probably say it's like a 45-50% in terms of battery life. Now, I mentioned earlier in this video about like how the iPods are kind of dying off, honestly. And I really honestly don't think that Apple's going to make another iPod. I kind of talked about it in another video about the iPod Touch 7th generation. Now, I'm kind of hoping they do make another one because I like this lineup. I like the iPods in general, but you have to keep in mind that they haven't really refreshed another one in so long. And it's been about 3 years, almost 4 years next year in July. And I don't really see Apple doing it. They kind of hit a gap in a kind of a weird spot where it's like phones are becoming so good now. Nobody wants to carry both an iPod and an iPhone, and the demographic for most people who would give an iPod like to their kids or to their whoever, those people are most likely going to go and just give them their old phone or give them their old iPhone or Android and be like, here, use this. There's no point in spending money on an iPod when you can just go and use an older phone that I used to have, and it's the same thing as an iPod, but it's just cheaper, and it's just no point in getting another device when we already have one laying around. And I kind of see that same thing here. There's so many iPods, and Apple made a lot of money off the iPods. Even the 6th generation, this one, they made a lot of money off it. So what I'll say is that there was a time and place for this iPod. Is it still worth it? Sure, it's still worth it. I mean, it works. It's still getting updates, which is pretty crazy. And I think there's, like I said, there's a time and place for it. But right now, as it exists, I just don't think like Apple will go and make another iPod Touch. I think this is the last iPod Touch they'll make. I think this is the last iPod they'll make, and they're just going to end it at that. It had a really good run. The iPod Touch series was very successful. The iPod in general was super amazing. I mean, it really revolutionized, how music was played and how people really exchange music and a lot. I don't think iTunes and even music streaming as a whole would have gotten to the point as it is now versus what it used to be. And even like the music streaming things and everything like that, I mean, everyone streams their music. Nobody really puts it on a device anymore. And if you have an iPod, you're pretty much almost guaranteed to be on Wi-Fi. And you can't really listen to Spotify and SoundCloud on the go when you're on Spotify all the time. And you need that internet connection. So that's pretty much it. I think the iPod Touch 6th generation is a worthy end for Apple's iPod lineup. But what I'll tell you is like this. If you plan on getting an iPod Touch 6th generation, go for it. I mean, I'm not going to stop you. I just don't think there's really any reason for it. If you currently have an iPod Touch 6th generation, what I want you to do is go cherish that thing out, take it for a date, make it feel good. You know, it's a decent device. And I'd be really happy if Apple actually ended it here. There's really no point in keeping it forward. Even if they go and update it to another software version, I think that'd be pretty impressive. If it gets iOS 13, I mean, I think it'd be pretty pointless, but I think it'd be really fun to see how an iPod Touch released in 2015 could handle a potential complete UI redesign. So that's pretty much where I'm going to end it. Get an iPod Touch 6th generation if you want it. Me personally, I was surprised by it overall, and I definitely have respect for the iPod Touch 6th generation, but that is pretty much it. If you guys have any questions or you have any thoughts about the 6th generation iPod Touch, let me know in the comment section below. I'm going to read them, obviously. I want to see what you guys have to say, so definitely leave some comments down there about it. But hit that like button if you guys enjoyed the video. That'll mean so much. Every single like we get definitely counts, and every single subscriber we get also counts, so definitely hit that subscribe button. That'll mean so much. Check out the links in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my second channel is also linked down there. If you guys like these type of videos, I would really appreciate if you guys could support me on those things. Those are all linked down below. I'd really appreciate if you guys could check those out. But more importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.